Well, Matthew, so good to have you connect with the Innovation and Mission audience. Thanks for taking a little time to do this interview.
Yeah, I appreciate it, John. Always happy to join you and speak about the innovation and missions.
Yeah, it's really a critical task which you took on in your recent article on the 10 questions that we need to really wrestle with as we look forward to 2050. One of the things that I've done over the years is I've done several kind of trend reports and kind of data analysis, especially out of my time with GMI, where just looking at, how do trends affect missions? And I think your article does something similar, but just a bit of a different vantage point. But it's really, really important work. So thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'd like to start out with a question about really the format.
Yeah.
So many times you see it, at the beginning of the year in January, you see top 10 tech trends or, all those kind of things. But you've took the form of questions. And I'd love to hear from you a little bit of why you chose to use the question format rather than maybe more of a predictive, here's the predictions I'll make, that sort of thing.
Yeah, certainly. As you mentioned, anytime we have an article like this, or even thinking about the future of something, it's very tempting to begin to say it's going to do this, it's going to do that. And as you can imagine, you've worked in this area, that's sometimes challenging and or sometimes loose interpretation of what could happen. The certainness of the future is a challenge. But with that, let me say, oftentimes innovation isn't something that sparks completely new 10 years from now and then just shoots up like wildfire. Most often innovation is on the desks of people right now, in the conversations in the university, in the boardrooms happening. And so we can be pretty clear about what are the conversations happening. So the idea of forming this as questions begins to hopefully map what are the conversations happening now that are clearly going to affect between now and 2050. And we know that's going to shape it, but we also don't know the exact answer. But I think the advantage of asking questions instead of predictions is that it invites people into that conversation. As we think about innovations and missions, one of the key things here is oftentimes in these larger societal questions, Christians aren't often at the table, or perhaps not as at the table as much as they should be. So the idea and the hope behind questions is to provide the conversation to people in hopes that the Christian church and the Christian missions organizations enter into that conversation to help shape that questions. It's not a determinative end, it's a very open end. And I pray that the church mission organizations and churches are part of that conversation.
That's a good perspective. And I think especially because you put it out to 2050, a much longer horizon than, the trends for 2023, right?
Right.
When you put it out like that, it does really lend itself to what are the conversations, because like you said, things are going to change so much, in these next years. It's very, very hard to get a sense for where things will go. But you really led well into my next question. And I promise to everyone, I didn't send these questions ahead to Matthew.
It's true, I could verify.
But you actually led really well into it. When you talked about Christians being at the table versus not being at the table, one of the questions I wanted to ask you about was this kind of as you think about how the world would answer the questions that you asked in that article and how the church would answer. What's maybe a central tension or a point of obvious demarcation where the church's answers to these 10 big questions and the world's answers really, really kind of go in different directions? What's your sense?
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's particularly interesting with these set of questions. I will say oftentimes when we hear about questions and innovations and missions, it's often internal focused. What are we doing different? How's it going? But I'll say, John, the approach to this formulation of questions came almost 50% from what's the world asking and what's the Christian church asking. So to your point, there's a real divergence that will happen, but I'm hoping that the convergence of these two will come together as we begin to ask questions about what is the world asking and how can we participate in that. But your question, how are we potentially answering different or how are we diverging? I think fundamentally, from the Christian point of view, there's a sense of objectivity and core and foundation that doesn't move. I think the world is very willing to shift and direct. But I think there are certainly things we can learn from both sides of that conversation where we don't ever want to give up our foundations, our truth, our goodness, our beauty that is taught within scriptures and by Christ. But I think the willingness to see the world how it is and move to the world in a contextualized way, perhaps the secular conversation is a little more adept at, a little bit more nimble at, as they begin to follow that. So I hope it's not completely divergent. I hope there's actually a cross learning that can happen as Christians come to the table for these larger societal questions, that we can provide an anchor or a mooring to the broader secular conversation to say, this is truth, this is where we need to be. But also Christians can understand and learn perhaps from the secular side of how do we begin to contextualize more? How do we begin, that's a Christian word, but how do we begin to understand the world in its shiftings and be able to learn techniques and tactics from that so we can actually come together. Certainly there's divergent answers, but hopefully it can come and share and we can learn from each other.
Yeah, you hit on a really great point that that in a world where there is not a moral imperative, you can shift to meet any felt need, right?
All the time, very quickly. Yeah.
When you have this moral grounding or core that we have in who Christ Jesus is and what he means in our lives and what he stands for and what he asks of us, then responding to felt needs and shifting looks a little different, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
That's interesting. No, that's an interesting perspective on what would allow, what does flexibility look like in the church, right? We think about innovation; it's all about being nimble and agile and flexible. Well, what does it mean to be flexible when we have this moral foundation that we believe in and that we're holding to?
Yeah, it's a challenging question, and as these questions get answered, it's going to shape the plausibility of the gospel all around us in different ways. And so we need to remain nimble in the sense that this is the core truth, but we've always maybe communicated it this way. But as the plausibility shifts, maybe we can keep that core truth, but communicate it this way to kind of attend to those shifting plausibilities as the questions get answered.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Now, as you think about the questions that you asked in the article, came up with, which one challenged you most deeply? Maybe you personally, as you were wrestling with them. Which one really hit home to you?
Yeah, I think there's certainly two that are deeply challenging and are even difficult to think about. As sometimes the question of what does it mean to be human is fundamentally a core question that we maybe have asked in light or in a shallow way throughout history, but just core shaking who are we as humans is a question that is existential. So I think that hits perhaps for myself as well as others, and not just will, let's say, artificial intelligence take over creativity and therefore can no longer be a professor of creativity, something like that. But even the notion of, can I edit out my flaws? Can I edit out sin? And then that slippery slope begins to say, can I edit out God? And what's the felt need for that? Right? It's challenging in all senses, both existentially, religiously, right? Salvifically. And that seems to be a really important question that shakes a lot of moorings on a lot of different levels. The second question, to expand beyond one, I think is, what is it? Can we reach sustainability? But I think there's certain trends within that. Certainly, creation care and sustainability is a big issue, but particular issues that we're looking at in Lausanne Movement, like what the rising debt ratios around the world and the decentralization of plausibility as you move into decentralization, the Web3 kind of ideas. These are so much assumed foundations of the world that when debt ratios crack or shake, that again begins to shake the entire mooring of our world when it has ramifications that we're not even fully aware of at this point. So just recognizing at any point when the foundation really cracks, whether it means to be human or kind of the sustainability on different areas of sustainability, that is challenging. There's a lot of ramifications that are difficult to even imagine.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So what does it mean to be human, and really what does it mean to thrive, right? In that sustainability realm, what does it look like to have a thriving life where you have the resources you need, right? And that's some big questions around that today.
There is. I mean, a lot of us are in missions, particularly in this podcast or in this newsletter, Innovation and Missions. The shifting debt ratios, as that evaporates, as much as our heart is to continue our work, that's challenging. Right?
Yep.
That needs to be in place.
Absolutely. No, those are two good ones. Yeah, I think those were those were on my top list as well, of
Mhm.
ones that I was thinking about as I was reading, and the other one for me was the one about community.
Mm.
I have a real heart for discipleship personally,
Yeah.
and what does it mean to be believers together, and how's that changing,
Mhm.
and what are the implications on individual lives as well as the church as a whole. I think there's some
Yeah,
significant.
and again, I think that really dovetails in with what does it mean to be human? Like, what's my identity? Is it my ethnic tribe? Is it my digital tribe? Right? Is it what is my community? How does that work? Is again core shaking to understand those shifts and how that's working, and the implications of that on discipleship are huge.
Yeah. So last question. If you were to have to lead a discussion group and start
Mm.
the discussion with one of these questions, so you could start with any of the 10, but you were going to launch in, and what's a good entry point, if especially think about some of our audience who might want to use this article as a discussion starter for their missions teams, their ministry teams, etc. Where would you kind of jump in as far as the questions go, and launch into the interaction with the article?
Yeah. I mean, as a professor, I'm going to reinterpret the question and give you two depending on the audience. I think if we're talking about mission innovators and mission leaders, I think fundamentally the question is what is a digital life? Is fundamentally absolutely shaking and moving who we are, what we are, and what we do. That requires careful attention, and not just a wholesale acceptance, but not a wholesale rejection. What is a digital life is key to think, and should be shaping all of our ministries at this point. If it's not a industry leader and just a kind of a general church member, I think the question of where does hope lie is a wonderful starting point, and is probably the broader conversation in media as we begin to look towards radical politics, where we begin to look towards transhumanism and kind of development of tech, as we begin to even look towards secularism or other religions. There's a lot of impulses right now as the world searches for hope outside of the faith. And that's probably the loudest conversation that an average church member might be aware of. It would be a great starting point.
Okay. No, those make a lot of sense. Well, as we wrap up here, love to give you a chance to share, number one, what you do and how you're
Mhm.
connected to Lausanne, and kind of how those fit together. Just give us a minute or so on your background so that everyone has a sense for who you are.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm Dr. Matthew Niermann. I serve on staff for the Lausanne Movement. In my current role, I serve as a director of the State of the Great Commission report for Seoul 2024, Lausanne's fourth Global Congress coming up. In this report, we're looking at the current trends and current trajectory of the State of the Great Commission, and where we are now, what's the pulse, and where's it generally going. We're also looking at from today to 2050, what are the key issues that'll be shaping our world and shaping missions at that point. It's much more expanded than this article, maybe 40 topics that we're looking at in that. And then it's also looking at what's that reality of the regional level? How do the global trends work itself out in the regions, and perhaps how are the regions slightly different than the globe in its own particularities? So much of my work is looking and working and talking with people, wonderful leaders around the world, to understand this and do the best we can to bring this together to a single report that can be published in 2024.
Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to interacting with that, and if people want to, especially around the world, want to engage with the Lausanne 4 process, just Lausanne.org or any other place.
Lausanne.org is a wonderful place. There's a link to Lausanne 4 process, and lots of different avenues to engage with on there.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Matt, for taking a little bit of time to chat today.
Yeah, thanks so much. Take care.